In a Brooklyn courtroom, Walter Grady, a 66-year-old homeless veteran, faces charges for stealing a loaf of bread from Morelli's market. Known for his quiet dignity, Walter, a former staff sergeant, spiraled into despair after his wife's death and a VA misdiagnosis. Caught by new security mirrors, he pleads guilty, admitting hunger drove him. The stern Judge Carmichael, reading Walter's file, pauses abruptly, his expression shifting as he recognizes the name. The courtroom buzzes with confusion as he calls a recess, leaving Walter's fate hanging. What secret from Walter's past has stirred the judge's emotions? Stay tuned to uncover the truth. Join us at Q Incredible Stories to uncover more tales of truth and justice. Subscribe now to support our mission of sharing inspiring stories like Walter's. Share this video with someone who needs hope, and let's spread the message that kindness and justice always prevail. Your support keeps these stories alive. In the dimly lit Brooklyn municipal courtroom, the prosecutor's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended stealing a loaf of bread from Morelli's corner market," he declared, his tone as icy as the November wind outside. His words carried no trace of empathy, only the mechanical precision of someone accustomed to reciting charges without a second thought. Walter Grady, the man in question, stood silently at the defendant's table, his frail frame slouched under the weight of years and hardship. His head bowed low, silver hair spilling over his forehead, matted from neglect. The courtroom erupted in a ripple of chuckles at the seeming absurdity of the crime, stealing bread of all things. But Walter's soft, gravelly voice silenced the laughter. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he murmured, his words heavy with exhaustion and a quiet, unshakable truth. The crowd's amusement faded, but it was the judge's reaction that shifted the room's atmosphere. His eyes, usually steady and impassive, glistened with unshed tears. Why? Who was this man to him? What memory stirred behind the judge's furrowed brow? Walter, now 66, had long been a ghostly figure in his Brooklyn neighborhood, a man who blended into the cracked sidewalks and shadowed doorways. His weathered face, etched with deep lines, and his silver beard, tangled and untrimmed, told a story of a life worn thin. He carried a faded green military backpack, its straps frayed from years of use, a relic from his days in the U.S. Army. The bag was his only constant companion, stuffed with the meager possessions he still clung to, a few clothes, a worn-out book, and a dog tag that hung around his neck, its edges smoothed by time. To the locals, Walter was simply the quiet one. Unlike others who roamed the streets, shouting for change or causing a stir, he moved with a deliberate stillness, as if trying not to disturb the world around him. He collected bottles for recycling, their clinking a faint soundtrack to his days, and gratefully accepted leftovers from kind-hearted restaurant workers. Each night, he rotated the doorways he slept in, careful not to overstay his welcome or burden any single shopkeeper. Few knew the weight of Walter's past. For over 2 decades, he had served his country, earning an honorable discharge in 2004. Those years had been filled with purpose, structure, and pride. But in 2008, his world collapsed when his wife Margaret succumbed to cancer, a disease the VA hospital had misdiagnosed until it was too late. The loss shattered him. Margaret had been his anchor, her laughter the melody of his days, her gentle touch a reminder of home no matter where his service took him. Without her, Walter's heart unraveled. Depression wrapped its cold fingers around him, and he pushed away family, friends, anyone who tried to help. He sold their modest apartment, unable to bear its empty rooms, and donated every penny to Margaret's favorite charity, a small organization that helped children with cancer. Then he vanished into the streets of New York, choosing anonymity over the pain of being someone who had failed the person he loved most. "Sometimes it's easier to be nobody," he once confided to a soup kitchen volunteer, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might make his grief too real. That November afternoon had been merciless, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and made every breath ache. Snow loomed on the horizon, and Walter hadn't eaten in 3 days. His hands trembled, not just from hunger, but from the relentless chill that his threadbare coat couldn't fend off. He slipped into Morelli's corner market, a small, cluttered shop where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the tang of overripe fruit. The loaf he eyed was day-old, slightly stale but still golden, sitting on a shelf like a promise of survival. As Mr. Morelli busied himself with another customer, Walter's trembling fingers tucked the bread into his coat. His heart pounded, not with fear of being caught, but with shame for what he'd become. He wasn't a thief, not in his soul, but hunger had a way of rewriting a man's principles. Mr. Morelli's sharp voice shattered the moment. "Hey, stop right there," he bellowed, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the bulge in Walter's jacket. The shopkeeper had recently installed security mirrors, their gleaming surfaces betraying Walter's desperate act. "I'm calling the cops," Morelli said, already reaching for the phone, his tone a mix of anger and resignation. Walter didn't run. He stood frozen, the bread still half visible, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said again, his voice barely audible, as if pleading for understanding rather than forgiveness. Two patrol officers arrived swiftly. The younger one, Officer Jenkins, hesitated as he approached Walter. His gaze caught on the dog tag glinting faintly at Walter's neck, its surface worn but still legible. "You really a vet?" Jenkins asked, his voice softer than his partner's, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Walter nodded, his expression distant. "I used to be someone useful. Not anymore." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, snapping the handcuffs onto Walter's thin wrists with a gentleness that betrayed his unease. "Gotta take you in, sir," he said, almost apologetically. "Store owner's pressing charges. Says you've been caught shoplifting before." Walter said nothing, his silence a heavy acknowledgement of a truth he couldn't deny. At the precinct, Walter was processed with the cold efficiency reserved for petty thieves. The public defender assigned to him barely glanced up from her stack of files, her questions rote and her attention elsewhere. To her, Walter was just another case to clear before lunch. He was given a court date for the next morning, a preliminary hearing where the charge of theft would be formalized. That night, in a cramped holding cell, Walter sat on the edge of a metal bench, his wrinkled clothes reeking of the streets. His thoughts drifted to Margaret, her smile, the way she'd hum while cooking, the way she'd believed in him even when he doubted himself. He wondered what she'd think of him now, reduced to this. The next morning, Walter was led into the courtroom, his hands still cuffed, his clothes unchanged. The room buzzed with the hum of routine, lawyers shuffling papers, reporters scribbling notes for bigger cases, court staff moving through their tasks with mechanical precision. No family sat in the audience, no friends stood ready to speak on his behalf. Walter was alone, a solitary figure in a sea of indifference. But as his name was called, the judge's face changed. A flicker of recognition, then a flood of emotion, turned his stern demeanor into something raw and unguarded. Tears welled in his eyes, and for a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Who was Walter Grady to this judge? And what long-buried memory had his name awakened? The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of routine, a machine churning through its daily grind. Case number 47-293, State versus Walter Grady, the clerk droned, his voice flat, stripped of any hint of interest. A young prosecutor, barely out of law school, rose to his feet, his fingers nervously smoothing the knot of his tie. His crisp suit and eager posture screamed ambition, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, as if he were still adjusting to the weight of his role in this theater of justice. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but clipped. The defendant was apprehended stealing a single loaf of bread from a local market. Given his history of petty theft and his lack of a permanent address, the state recommends detention until trial. He sat down, satisfied with his delivery, though his mind was already drifting to the next case on his docket. To him, Walter Grady was just another name, another file, another faceless figure in the endless parade of minor offenders. Judge Michael Carmichael, a man whose reputation for swift, no-nonsense rulings preceded him, sat high on the bench, his stern face etched with lines of experience and authority. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, flicked down to the case file before him. He barely glanced at the defendant, a ragged man slouched in the wooden chair across the room. The courtroom spectators, reporters, bored onlookers, and a few regulars who haunted the galleries had already tuned out. To them, this was a non-story, another homeless drifter caught in the system's net, destined for a quick, guilty plea and a return to the streets or a cell. Whispers rustled through the crowd, a mix of indifference and quiet judgment. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead?" Judge Carmichael's voice cut through the murmur, his tone formal but tinged with impatience. He lifted his gaze, meeting the defendant's eyes for the first time. Walter Grady, a man whose weathered face told a story of hardship, stood slowly. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, threadbare and stained, a stark contrast to the polished wood and gleaming marble of the courtroom. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but clear, carrying a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in this cold procedural space. "Guilty, Your Honor, then," he said, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I was hungry." A snicker rippled from the back row, sharp and cruel. Walter didn't flinch, but the sound seemed to hang in the air, a reminder of the world's casual disdain for men like him. Judge Carmichael's head snapped toward the noise, his glare silencing the offender with the precision of a marksman. For a moment, the room held its breath, but the judge's attention returned to the file before him, his fingers tracing the text as he read aloud. "Walter Edward Grady, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army." The words seemed to catch in his throat, and his voice faltered, an uncharacteristic crack breaking through his usual composure. The courtroom fell silent, the air growing heavy with an unspoken shift. The judge's hand tightened on the edge of the bench, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the wood. His eyes darted from the file to Walter, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the man before him with the name on the page. Walter stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor, his face unreadable. If he sensed the change in the room, he gave no sign of it. His thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in memories of hunger, cold nights, and the relentless grind of survival. He had long since stopped expecting understanding or mercy from the world. The snicker from the gallery still echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of how far he had fallen. Once, he had been a man of purpose, a soldier who carried the weight of duty with pride. Now he was a ghost, invisible to all but the law when it came to punish him. Judge Carmichael's expression shifted, a storm of emotions flickering across his face. Shock, recognition, and something deeper, almost painful. Without a word, he rose to his feet, the abrupt motion sending a ripple of confusion through the room. Judges didn't stand during routine hearings. It simply wasn't done. The prosecutor froze, his mouth half open, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The spectators exchanged glances, their earlier indifference replaced by curiosity. What had just happened? Why was the judge, known for his unshakable demeanor, suddenly acting so strangely? "Your Honor," the prosecutor ventured, his voice tentative, as if testing the waters of an unfamiliar protocol. "Court will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Carmichael declared, his voice rough, almost hoarse. "The defendant will remain." He turned and strode toward his chambers, his robes billowing behind him, leaving the courtroom in a state of a stunned silence. As the door closed behind him, the room erupted in hushed speculation, a chorus of whispers trying to make sense of the unprecedented pause. Walter remained where he stood, his eyes still locked on the floor. If he was aware of the stir his case had caused, he showed no sign of it. His mind drifted to the loaf of bread, its crusty warmth still vivid in his memory. He hadn't meant to steal, not really, but the hunger had gnawed at him, a relentless beast that drowned out reason. He thought of the market clerk's accusing stare, the shame that had burned in his chest as he was led away in cuffs. He wondered, not for the first time, how his life had come to this. In his chambers, Judge Michael Carmichael sank into his chair, his heart pounding. His fingers, still trembling, reached for a drawer in his desk and pulled out a worn photograph, its edges frayed from years of handling. The image showed a group of soldiers in desert fatigues, standing in front of a medical tent in Iraq. The judge's younger self was there, a field medic with a determined set to his jaw, his eyes bright with the conviction of youth. And in the back row, standing tall with a quiet strength, was Walter Grady. The judge's breath caught as memories flooded back. Dusty convoys, the crack of gunfire, the camaraderie of men bound by shared hardship. Walter had been a rock, a logistics sergeant who kept supplies moving through the chaos of war. The judge remembered his steady presence, the way he'd crack a dry joke to ease the tension after a long day. How had that man ended up here, broken and alone? Carmichael turned to his computer, his fingers moving with purpose as he accessed a military database, a privilege he retained from his work with Veterans Affairs. Walter Grady's service record filled the screen, confirming what the judge's heart already knew. 3 tours of duty, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. A Bronze Star for Valor earned in 2003 when Walter had driven a burning supply truck away from a group of wounded soldiers, saving 17 lives despite his own injuries. The judge's eyes lingered on a photograph attached to the file, one that had once graced the front page of the New York Times. Walter, his face grim but resolute, carrying an injured Afghan child to a medical helicopter during a humanitarian mission. For a brief moment, he had been a symbol of hope, a testament to the compassion that could endure even in the midst of war. The judge leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past pressing down on him. Guilt gnawed at his heart. He had built a life after the war, law school, a judgeship, a comfortable home. But Walter, like so many others, had been left behind, discarded by a country that had asked everything of him and given little in return. The judge's eyes burned with unshed tears as he thought of the man in the courtroom, hungry and defeated, pleading guilty for a loaf of bread. How had it come to this? And what could he, Michael Carmichael, do to make it right? In the dimly lit courtroom, the air hung heavy with the weight of untold stories, the kind that linger in the crevices of a life worn thin by time and hardship. Walter Grady sat on a hard wooden bench, his weathered hands folded tightly in his lap, his faded jacket barely holding together at the seams. The charge against him was petty, stealing a loaf of bread from a corner store, but the accusation seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime's neglect. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion, traced the cracks in the courtroom floor, each one a mirror to the fractures in his own existence. For 15 years, Walter had lived in the shadows of a society that had long since turned its gaze away from men like him, veterans who had given everything and received little in return. Once, he had been a soldier, a man of purpose, but now he was just another face in the crowd, invisible to the world that bustled around him. The judge, Michael Carmichael, sat at his elevated bench, his fingers leafing through a stack of faded documents that told a story far greater than the minor theft before him. Most of the reports detailed Walter's service, missions in dusty, war-torn lands, acts of bravery that had faded from public memory as quickly as the headlines had shifted. But one report, declassified only recently, stopped the judge's breath. Dated July 2003, it recounted a frantic evacuation under a hail of enemy fire. Walter, then a young sergeant, had carried an injured medic, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, 2 miles through a storm of bullets and shrapnel to safety. Walter himself had been wounded, jagged metal tearing into his shoulder. Yet he pressed on, driven by a fierce determination to save the man in his arms. Michael's heart pounded as he read the words, his mind spiraling back to that chaotic night. The screams of battle, the weight of his own broken body, and the steady voice of a man called Grady shouting through the din, "Hold on, kid, we're getting out of this," flooded his memory. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling with awe and disbelief. "It's him." For years, Judge Carmichael had searched for the man who had saved his life. The name Grady had been a fleeting echo in the chaos of war, a single word shouted amidst the roar of gunfire. After his discharge, Walter had vanished, slipping into the anonymity of civilian life without leaving so much as a trace. Michael had carried the weight of that debt, the gnawing need to thank the stranger who had given him a second chance. Now, fate had brought them together in this unlikely place, a courtroom where one man held the gavel and the other faced judgment for a loaf of bread. Walter, unaware of the judge's revelation, sat in solitude as the courtroom emptied for recess. The bailiff, distracted by the glow of his phone, barely glanced at the ragged man in the corner. Walter's thoughts drifted, as they often did, to Margaret, his Maggie. Her memory was a lighthouse in the storm of his life, guiding him through the darkest nights. She had been his anchor, her laughter a melody that once filled their small home with warmth. But when the VA hospital misdiagnosed her cancer, that warmth had turned to ash. The bureaucracy had failed her, failed him, and when she slipped away, Walter's world crumbled. The grief was a living thing, wrapping around his heart like barbed wire, tightening with every memory. Untreated PTSD from his years in combat only deepened the wound, turning his nights into battlegrounds of nightmares and his days into a haze of survival. He had walked away from everything, his benefits, his pension, his very identity, because the system that had taken Maggie felt like a betrayal too great to forgive. On the streets, Walter became a ghost. To the townsfolk, he was a nuisance, a shadow to be swept away. Teenagers mocked him, tossing scraps of food as if he were a stray dog, their laughter cutting deeper than the cold. Shopkeepers sprayed their sidewalks with hoses, erasing the traces of his existence. The police, responding to complaints, nudged him along with weary indifference. Even among the homeless, Walter was an outsider, his quiet demeanor and sudden screams in the night keeping others at a distance. He survived by scavenging bottles and cans, their meager redemption enough to buy cough syrup when winter's chill settled into his lungs. Pride, forged in the discipline of his military training, kept him from begging. He carried on, driven by a stubborn self-reliance that refused to break, even as his body and spirit wore thin. In his pocket, wrapped in a scrap of plastic to shield it from the rain, was a photograph of Maggie. Her smile, frozen in time, was his only tether to the man he used to be. On the worst days, when despair threatened to swallow him whole, Walter would hold the photo close and whisper, "Almost there, Maggie. Just holding on a little longer." The words were a promise, a vow to endure, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was for her, or perhaps it was for the part of himself that still believed in the man he had once been. In his chambers, Judge Carmichael's hands shook as he made a series of urgent phone calls. The first was to the VA office, his voice firm but laced with urgency as he demanded immediate verification of Walter's service record. The second was to James Mason, now a colonel, who had served alongside them both in those desperate days of 2003. "Mason, it's Michael Carmichael," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I found him, the man who pulled me out at Fallujah. He's in my courtroom right now, homeless, charged with stealing bread." The silence on the other end was heavy, a shared recognition of the debt they both owed. "I'm 3 hours away," Mason finally said, his tone resolute. "Don't let him leave." Michael's mind raced, torn between judicial ethics and the overwhelming need to right a wrong. He couldn't dismiss the case outright. His position demanded impartiality, but he could ensure justice took a different path. He scribbled a note on official letterhead, his pen moving with purpose. "Walter Grady is not an ordinary homeless man. He is a symbol of loyalty forgotten by the country he served." The words felt inadequate, but they were a start. As he returned to the courtroom, his clerk noticed a document on her desk that hadn't been there before. The famous photograph of Walter, young and strong, holding an Afghan child during a moment of fleeting peace in the war. Beneath it was a handwritten note in Colonel Mason's familiar scrawl. "Some heroes never asked to be remembered." The clerk's breath caught as she recognized the handwriting from prior correspondence on veteran affairs. The connection was undeniable, a thread tying past to present, sacrifice to redemption. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet tension, the kind that settles over a room when secrets are about to unravel. Walter Grady sat at the defendant's table, his weathered hands clasped tightly, his eyes tracing the grain of the wooden surface as if it held answers to the chaos of his life. He was no stranger to judgment. Years on the streets had taught him how quickly people could dismiss a man like him, with his tattered coat and unshaven face. But today felt different, heavier, like the air itself carried the weight of something unspoken. Walter wasn't just any defendant, and the ripples of his past were about to crash into the present, touching lives he never imagined he'd reach, especially those now holding his fate in their hands. When the court reconvened after a brief recess, Walter sensed the shift immediately. Judge Michael Carmichael, who had presided over countless cases with the cool detachment of a seasoned jurist, seemed altered. The man's usual stoic expression had softened, replaced by a flicker of something Walter couldn't quite pin down, respect perhaps, or recognition. It stirred a knot of unease in Walter's chest. He wasn't used to being seen, not really. For years he'd been invisible, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a society that had long since stopped caring. Before he could dwell on the judge's change in demeanor, the proceedings veered into uncharted territory. In light of newly uncovered information regarding the defendant's background, Judge Carmichael's voice boomed, steady but laced with an undercurrent of gravity. This court will postpone further proceedings pending a thorough investigation. Mr. Grady will remain in custody until tomorrow's hearing. The words landed like a gavel, sharp and final. Walter glanced at the prosecutor, a young man whose furrowed brow betrayed his confusion, though he offered no objection. Walter, accustomed to the system's opaque machinery grinding over him without explanation, simply nodded. He'd learned long ago that asking questions rarely yielded answers. As the bailiff led him from the courtroom, Judge Carmichael's voice cut through the shuffle of footsteps. "And see that Mr. Grady receives a proper meal and medical attention." The words hung in the air, unexpected and almost tender. Walter's steps faltered for a moment, his mind racing. A proper meal? Medical attention? He couldn't remember the last time anyone had cared enough to ensure he was fed, let alone tended to him. The gesture felt like a crack in the armor of his isolation, but he didn't dare trust it. Not yet. That evening, as Walter sat in his cell, the world outside was already spinning his story into something else. A local news blog had caught wind of the day's events, publishing a headline that dripped with skepticism. "Homeless man claims military hero status. Judge delays sentencing for bread thief." The comment section erupted with vitriol, each anonymous jab a fresh wound. "Another street person making up stories about being a vet," one read. "If he really served, why is he stealing bread instead of collecting VA benefits?" Another sneered. The words cut deeper than Walter cared to admit, each one a reminder of the life he'd lost, the man he'd once been. In the county holding facility, the hostility found a more tangible form. A young inmate, his face twisted with righteous anger, cornered Walter in the dim corridor. "Stolen valor is disgusting, old man," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "My brother died in Afghanistan, and fakes like you use the uniform to get sympathy." Before Walter could respond, the inmate shoved him hard against the concrete wall. Pain flared in Walter's shoulder, but he didn't fight back. He never did. He'd absorbed worse blows, both physical and otherwise, over the years. Society's indifference had hardened him, taught him to swallow his pain like bitter medicine. He stood there silent as the young man stormed off, leaving Walter to slide down the wall, his breath ragged. That night, Walter didn't touch the meal they brought him. The tray sat untouched on the cot, the smell of lukewarm food doing nothing to stir his appetite. Instead, he clutched the worn military ID tags he always carried, their edges smooth from years of handling. Tucked against them was a faded photo of Margaret, her smile frozen in time, a reminder of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. As he traced her face with his thumb, a wave of longing washed over him. Why, after all these years of being invisible, had someone finally looked at him, really looked, and seen something worth noticing? The question gnawed at him, keeping sleep at bay as he lay in the dark, the weight of his past pressing against his chest. The next morning, Walter was escorted back to the courtroom, his mind still tangled in the events of the previous day. He had no idea that something extraordinary was unfolding beyond the heavy doors. The gallery, nearly empty the day before, was now packed to capacity. Every seat was filled, the air thick with anticipation. Outside, news cameras lined the steps, their lenses barred from the courtroom, but poised to capture whatever came next. Walter's confusion deepened as he took his place at the defense table, his heart thudding in his chest. His public defender, a harried young woman who'd barely had time to review his case, was nowhere to be seen. In her place stood an older man, his suit crisp and his demeanor calm but commanding. "Richard Harlow, Veterans Legal Defense Alliance," the man introduced himself, extending a hand. Walter shook it, his grip tentative, as if testing whether this was real. "Someone's taken an interest in your case, Mr. Grady," Harlow said, his tone warm but cryptic, offering no further explanation. Walter's mind raced, searching for meaning, but he found none. He felt like a man caught in a current, powerless to do anything but let it carry him. The courtroom doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room. The audience rose as Judge Carmichael entered, his presence commanding respect. But Walter's attention was drawn to the three military officers who followed, their dress uniforms pristine, their medals glinting under the fluorescent lights. Each step they took was deliberate, their faces etched with a solemnity that made Walter's breath catch. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Carmichael," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the silence. The proceedings began with an unusual formality, the judge's demeanor markedly different from the day before. Gone was the detached professionalism. In its place was a quiet intensity, as if the weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on him. "Before we address the charges against Mr. Grady," Judge Carmichael said, his voice steady but resonant, "this court will hear relevant testimony pertaining to the defendant's background, which may influence these proceedings." Walter's heart pounded as Colonel James Mason approached the witness stand. The man's face was older now, lined with the passage of 20 years, but Walter recognized him instantly. Memories flooded back, dusty battlefields, whispered promises to comrades, moments of courage and loss that had defined him long before he'd become a shadow on the streets. As Colonel Mason began to speak, Walter's confusion gave way to a fragile hope, a sense that perhaps, after all this time, his story might finally be heard. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet hum of anticipation as Colonel James Mason strode to the witness stand, his military posture as rigid and commanding as it had been the last time anyone in the room had laid eyes on him. His broad shoulders squared under the crisp lines of his uniform, and his eyes, sharp and resolute, scanned the room with the weight of years spent in service. As the bailiff administered the oath, Mason's voice rang out steady and clear, a testament to the discipline that had defined his life. "I am Colonel James Mason, currently stationed at Fort Hamilton, New York," he began, his tone clipped yet carrying an undercurrent of deep conviction. "I have known the defendant, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, since we served together in Iraq back in 2003. As he spoke, Mason's gaze drifted to Walter, seated at the defendant's table, his weathered face etched with lines that told a story of hardship and sacrifice. Walter's hands, calloused and trembling slightly, rested on the table, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he were bracing himself for judgment, not just from the court, but from the ghosts of his past. Mason's heart tightened at the sight. He remembered Walter as a young sergeant, brash and fearless, the kind of soldier who'd charge into hell with a grin. Now the man before him seemed diminished, not in spirit but in circumstance, his frame leaner, his eyes haunted by years of struggle no one in this room could fully grasp. Turning to face Walter directly, Mason's voice softened, though it still carried the authority of a man who'd led soldiers through chaos. "This man," he said, gesturing toward Walter, "saved the lives of 17 soldiers during an ambush near Fallujah." His words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the courtroom. The spectators leaned forward, their murmurs a low hum of surprise. Mason's mind flashed back to that day, the searing heat, the acrid smoke, the deafening crack of gunfire. He could still see Walter, his face streaked with sweat and blood, hauling himself into the driver's seat of a fuel truck engulfed in flames. "He drove that burning truck away from our convoy," Mason continued, his voice thick with the memory. "He sustained second-degree burns across his arms and back, but he kept going, knowing that if that truck exploded, it would have taken us all with it." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Mason's words pressing against every heart in the room. Walter's head dipped slightly, his jaw tightening as if he were fighting to keep his emotions in check. He hadn't spoken of that day in years, hadn't allowed himself to dwell on the pain that still flared in his scars on cold mornings. To him, it had been instinct, not heroism, just what needed doing. But hearing it recounted now in this sterile room made his chest ache with a mix of pride and sorrow. Mason pressed on, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "That wasn't all he did," he said, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on the judge. "Staff Sergeant Grady, despite shrapnel wounds tearing into his leg, carried a wounded medic, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, 2 miles through hostile territory to safety." At the mention of the name, a stir ran through the courtroom. All eyes turned to Judge Michael Carmichael, seated high on the bench, his face a mask of judicial neutrality. But for a fleeting moment, his composure faltered. His lips pressed into a thin line and his eyes, usually so guarded, glistened with something raw and unguarded. He gave a slight nod, confirming Mason's words, and in that gesture, a piece of his carefully constructed professional armor seemed to crack. Inside, Carmichael was reeling. He'd spent years trying to bury the memories of Iraq, the chaos and loss that had shaped him into the man he was now. But hearing his own name, spoken in connection to Walter Grady, brought it all rushing back. The weight of his wounded body slung over Walter's shoulder, the searing pain, the sound of Walter's labored breathing as he staggered through the desert. Carmichael had been a scared kid then, barely 19, certain he was going to die. Walter's gruff encouragement, his refusal to leave him behind, had been the only thing keeping him alive. Now, sitting in judgment over the man who'd saved him, Carmichael felt a surge of guilt and gratitude so powerful it nearly stole his breath. The prosecutor, a young man in a sharp suit, rose to his feet, his discomfort palpable. His face, usually composed and confident, betrayed a flicker of unease as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said, his voice careful, "while Colonel Mason's testimony speaks volumes about the defendant's past character, it doesn't alter the fact that Mr. Grady committed theft." He glanced at Walter, and for a moment, his resolve wavered. The man before him didn't look like a criminal, just tired, broken in ways that went beyond the physical. But duty compelled him to press on. Before the prosecutor could continue, Mason raised a hand, his expression unyielding. "If I may, Your Honor," he interjected, his tone brooking no argument. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick file, its edges worn from handling. "After reviewing Staff Sergeant Grady's records, we uncovered a grievous administrative error." His words hung in the air, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. In 2008, during a system migration, Walter Grady's pension and benefits were mistakenly terminated because he failed to respond to paperwork sent to an outdated address. Mason's voice grew quieter, but no less forceful. "He has been entitled to approximately $1,370 per month for the past 15 years, along with medical care for injuries sustained in service. That totals over $246,000 in unpaid benefits." The silence that followed was deafening. Walter's hands tightened on the table's edge, his knuckles whitening as the enormity of Mason's words sank in. His mind raced, a tumult of disbelief and anger. All those years of scraping by, of working odd jobs to keep a roof over his head, of ignoring the pain in his leg because he couldn't afford a doctor. Could it all have been because of a clerical mistake? He felt a bitter laugh bubble up in his chest, but he swallowed it, his throat tight with unshed tears. He'd never asked for much, just what he'd earned, and even that had been taken from him. Mason wasn't finished. He opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. "Furthermore," he said, his voice steady but infused with a quiet reverence, "we have affidavits from 5 members of Walter's old unit, all attesting to his character and service. Included is a letter from General Richards, who credits Walter with saving his son's life during that same ambush near Fallujah." He held up the letter, its official seal glinting under the courtroom lights, and the spectators erupted in hushed whispers. Walter's heart pounded. He hadn't known about the letter, hadn't realized how many of his old comrades still remembered him, still honored what he'd done. The thought brought a warmth to his chest he hadn't felt in years, but it was tempered by the weight of all he'd lost since then. Judge Carmichael cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Mr. Grady," he said, his tone formal but laced with something deeper, "would you please approach the bench?" Walter rose slowly, his bad legs stiff from sitting too long. Uncertainty gnawed at him as he shuffled forward, his eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. Carmichael's face was stern, but his eyes held a softness that caught Walter off guard. "Protocol," the judge continued, "would typically prevent me from presiding over a case involving someone with whom I have a personal connection. However, I did not recognize you yesterday. It was only after reviewing your file last night that I realized you were the man who saved my life in Iraq." A collective gasp swept through the gallery, and Walter's breath caught in his throat. He stared at Carmichael, his mind struggling to reconcile the polished judge before him with the bloodied private he'd carried to safety. The memory was vivid, Grady shouting his name across the battlefield, urging him to hold on. Walter's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, scraped raw by years of silence. "I was just doing my job, sir," he said, his words barely audible, but they carried the weight of truth. To him, it had never been about medals or recognition. It had been about the men beside him, about getting them home. Carmichael removed his glasses, his formal demeanor giving way to something profoundly human. His hands trembled slightly as he set them on the bench, and his voice when he spoke was thick with emotion. "You did far more than your job, Mr. Grady," he said, "and this country has failed to do its job for you." He paused, his eyes searching Walter's face, as if trying to memorize the man he'd spent nearly 2 decades searching for. "I've spent years trying to find you, to thank you. I never knew your full name, just Grady," shouted across that battlefield. The courtroom was silent now, every eye fixed on the two men. Walter felt exposed, raw, as if the walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling under the weight of Carmichael's words. He wanted to say something, to deflect the gratitude, but his throat was too tight, his mind too overwhelmed. All he could do was nod, a small, jerky motion that spoke volumes. Carmichael turned to the prosecutor, his voice regaining its judicial authority. "In light of these extraordinary circumstances, does the state wish to proceed with charges?" The young prosecutor stood, his face pale, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He glanced at Walter, then at Mason, and finally at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in it, "the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Grady with prejudice." "So ordered," Carmichael responded without hesitation, his gavel striking the bench with a sharp crack. "Mr. Grady, you are free to go." He paused, his gaze softening once more. "This court extends its deepest apologies for the miscarriage of justice that has extended far beyond this courtroom." Walter stood frozen, the words washing over him like a tide. Free. The weight of the past few months, the arrest, the shame, the fear, seemed to lift, if only slightly. He turned to Mason, who gave him a small, proud nod, and then to the gallery, where strangers looked at him not with judgment, but with respect. For the first time in years, Walter felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real, kindling in his chest. He didn't know what came next, but for now it was enough to know he wasn't alone. In the heavy silence of the courtroom, Walter Grady stood frozen, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The weight of the proceedings bore down on him, each word from the judge echoing in his mind like a distant memory of a life he'd long since buried. His weathered hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the surreal disbelief that his existence, once reduced to shadows and survival, had collided with this moment of reckoning. He felt like a ghost summoned back to the world of the living, unsure if he belonged. The creak of the courtroom's heavy back doors shattered the stillness. A woman in her mid-30s stepped inside, her presence tentative yet resolute. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, scanned the room until they locked onto Walter. Each step she took toward him seemed to carry the weight of years, her breath catching as she fought to hold herself together. Her auburn hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and her hands clutched a worn photograph, its edges frayed from years of being held. "Uncle Walter," she said, her voice breaking like a dam giving way. "I'm Rebecca, Margaret's niece. We've been searching for you for so long." Walter's stoic facade crumbled. His broad shoulders, once squared with the pride of a soldier, sagged under the weight of her words. Rebecca's arms wrapped around him, and for the first time in years, he felt the warmth of human connection that wasn't the cold grip of handcuffs or the impersonal pat-down of a police officer. His throat tightened, emotions he'd buried deep, grief, guilt, longing, rising like a tide he couldn't hold back. He'd spent so long convincing himself he was alone, forgotten, that this moment felt like a dream he didn't dare believe. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with chaos. Reporters swarmed like bees, their microphones thrust toward Colonel Mason, a man whose presence commanded respect. His jaw was set, his eyes burning with a quiet fury born of conviction. "This isn't just about one man," he declared, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "This is about thousands of Walter Gradys, veterans who fought for this country only to be abandoned by the very system they swore to protect. Today, we start fixing that." His words weren't just a statement, they were a battle cry, a promise to drag the forgotten into the light. By afternoon, Walter's story had ignited the internet. News helicopters circled above the courthouse. their blades slicing through the air like a reminder of the urgency of the moment. Walter emerged, transformed. Gone was the scruffy, hollow-eyed man who'd shuffled into court. Now, clean-shaven and dressed in crisp, donated clothes, he stood flanked by Colonel Mason and Judge Carmichael. The judge, having recused himself from the case, was there not as an authority but as a man bound to Walter by a debt that time couldn't erase. Walter felt the weight of their presence, a quiet reassurance that he wasn't alone anymore, though the spotlight made his skin itch with unease. Mr. Morelli, the store owner who'd pressed charges, pushed through the throng of reporters, his face pale and his eyes haunted. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice thick with shame. "I saw you as just another vagrant, another problem. I'm so sorry." The words hit Walter like a punch, stirring a mix of resentment and understanding. He'd been invisible for so long, reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of strangers. Yet Morelli's remorse was genuine, and Walter, too overwhelmed to form words, simply nodded. Inside, he wrestled with the urge to forgive, to let go of the bitterness that had kept him company in his darkest days. Within 48 hours, a veterans organization had rallied to Walter's cause, establishing a fund that swelled past 200,000 donations poured in from strangers moved by his story. Social media became a tapestry of voices, each thread a story of another veteran lost in the labyrinth of bureaucracy. The outcry reached the Department of Veterans Affairs, prompting an announcement of a sweeping review of terminated benefits cases. Walter read the posts online, his heart swelling with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that his pain had sparked change. Sorrow for the countless others still lost in the shadows. In a quiet moment away from the cameras, Judge Carmichael sought Walter out. The judge's face, usually stern and composed, softened as he spoke. "You carried me 2 miles through hell with shrapnel tearing through your leg," he said, his voice low, trembling with the weight of memory. "The medics told me you refused treatment until they'd stabilize me. You kept me alive." Walter's mind flashed back to that day, the chaos of war, the blood and smoke, the kid's pale face as he whispered, "Just keep breathing, kid." He'd never known if those words had mattered, but now, seeing the man that scared young medic had become, he felt a flicker of something like purpose. "You said my story wasn't over," Carmichael continued, his eyes glistening. "Those words kept me going, Walter. They pushed me to become a judge, to serve like you did. Everything good in my life, my career, my family, my chance to make a difference, it's because you didn't leave me behind." Walter looked at the judge, no longer seeing the robes or the gavel, but the terrified boy from his memories, clinging to life. "I'm glad some good came out of that day," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. For the first time in years, a smile broke across his face, genuine and warm, reaching the depths of his tired eyes. "No man left behind," he added, the phrase not just a mantra, but a vow that had defined him. 3 days later, Walter stood in Judge Carmichael's chambers, a new suit hugging his frame. Pinned to his chest were his military decorations, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and other ribbons that told the story of a man who'd given everything for his country. A Veterans Affairs representative stood before him, presenting his back benefits in a settlement for the administrative error that had stripped him of his dignity. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment, but Walter's focus was inward. He felt the weight of those medals, not as a burden, but as a reminder of who he'd been and who he could still be. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying the quiet strength of a man who'd survived the unimaginable. "I don't want pity," he said, addressing the room but speaking to the world. "I just hope the ones who come after me aren't forgotten like I was." His words, raw and unpolished, struck a chord. What began as a local story of one man's redemption had grown into a national reckoning, a call to honor those who'd served. Legislators, moved by Walter's ordeal, cited his case as they introduced bills to reform the veterans' benefits system, ensuring no one else would slip through the cracks. Walter stood at the center of it all, no longer invisible, his story a beacon for those still fighting to be seen. The photograph of Walter Grady, a grizzled veteran cradling a wounded Afghan child in his arms, resurfaced after years of obscurity, its raw humanity now juxtaposed against a stark image of him huddled on the frigid streets of Brooklyn. The contrast was jarring, a gut punch to anyone who saw it, forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truth about a nation that could lionize a hero in one breath and abandon him in the next. For 15 long years, Walter had been a ghost, a man whose existence barely registered in the bustling city he once called home. Now his story was inescapable, a mirror held up to society's conscience, reflecting its failures and its potential for redemption. The weight of his invisibility had lifted, replaced by a spotlight that illuminated both his pain and his resilience. Walter's heart carried the ache of those lost years, each one a quiet battle against despair. He had wandered Brooklyn's streets, his body weathered by time and hardship, his mind haunted by memories of war and the love he'd lost. Margaret, his wife, had been his anchor, her laughter a melody that once drowned out the echoes of gunfire in his dreams. Her death had unmoored him, leaving him adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for a man like him. Yet, even in his darkest moments, Walter clung to a flicker of pride, not the loud, boastful kind, but the quiet certainty that he had once done something good, something that mattered. That Afghan child, now grown, had survived because of him. That memory was a lifeline, even when he slept in doorways, the cold seeping into his bones. 6 months after the photograph went viral, Walter stepped into Veterans Village, a supportive housing community in Brooklyn. His new apartment was modest, a single room with plain walls and a small window that let in the morning light. It was the first place he could call home since Margaret's passing, and the weight of that fact settled over him like a warm blanket. He owned little, a worn duffel bag, a few changes of clothes, but the walls told a story. He hung photographs with care. Margaret, radiant in her wedding dress, her smile a promise of better days. His old unit in Iraq, their faces etched with the camaraderie that only shared sacrifice can forge. And a new image, one he hadn't expected to see. It was him standing tall beside Judge Carmichael at a veterans recognition ceremony, his chest puffed out just a little, a spark of pride rekindled in his eyes. These images were more than decorations. They were a map of his life, a testament to survival. Walter shied away from the media's clamor, their microphones and flashing cameras too much like the chaos he'd left behind in war. But when local schools invited him to speak, he didn't hesitate. He stood before classrooms of teenagers, some slouched and skeptical, others wide-eyed and curious, and shared his truth. He spoke of military service, the honor of it, the cost of it. He described the weight of coming home, the way the world could feel alien to someone who'd seen too much. His voice was steady, unpolished, carrying the gravel of experience. He didn't judge the kids, didn't talk down to them. To the troubled ones, the ones who hid their pain behind defiance, he offered stories of his own struggles, moments when he'd wanted to give up but didn't. They listened, drawn to his quiet dignity, his refusal to sugarcoat the hardship or the heroism. For Walter, these talks were a way to give back and to plant seeds of hope in young hearts that might one day bloom into resilience. Every afternoon, Walter found solace in Prospect Park. He'd sit on a bench, the same one where he'd once curled up against the biting wind when the streets were his only home. Now he watched children play, their laughter a soft echo of Margaret's. His eyes would soften, his thoughts drifting to the life he'd built and lost, and the one he was slowly rebuilding. The park was his sanctuary, a place where he could breathe, where the world didn't demand anything of him. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and let the sounds wash over him, the squeals of kids on swings, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, feeling for a moment like he belonged. Outside the Brooklyn courthouse, a new bronze plaque gleamed under the sun. Its inscription read, "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." Beside it, a relief sculpture captured Walter in his moment of valor, carrying the wounded medic who would later become Judge Carmichael, the American flag billowing behind them. The image was a bridge between past and present, a reminder of sacrifice and second chances. At the dedication ceremony, the mayor's voice rang out, announcing the Grady Initiative, an annual fund to provide legal aid for homeless veterans. Walter stood in the crowd, his hands clasped tightly, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. This wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran who'd been left behind, every soul who deserved a chance to be seen. A 10-year-old boy who'd once watched Walter collect bottles along the streets penned an essay that stirred the city. In his childish scrawl, he wrote, "Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead." The words, simple yet profound, won a citywide competition and were read aloud at a city council meeting on homelessness policy. Walter, who'd never sought the spotlight, felt a lump in his throat when he heard the boy's words. They were a reminder that even in his darkest days, someone had seen him, not as a failure, but as a man carrying a story worth telling. Walter's friendship with Judge Carmichael grew quietly, rooted in mutual respect. On Sunday evenings, he'd join the judge's family for dinner, the warmth of their home a stark contrast to the cold streets he'd known. One night, the judge's young son looked at Walter with wide, curious eyes and asked if he was angry about all those years spent homeless. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken pain. Walter paused, his fork hovering over his plate, his mind sifting through the years of loss and survival. "I don't need anyone's pity," he said finally, his voice steady but soft. "I just hope those who come after will remember those who came before." The words carried the weight of his truth. A man who'd endured not for himself, but for the hope that others might not have to. On Veterans Day, Walter stood at Fort Hamilton, his dress uniform crisp against his weathered frame. It was the first time in decades he'd worn it, and the fabric felt like a second skin, a reminder of the man he'd once been and was becoming again. The crowd before him, soldiers young and old, families, civilians, waited for his words. He spoke briefly, his voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who'd seen both the worst and the best of humanity. "I once protected this country," he said, his gaze steady. "Now the country has protected me back." He paused, his throat tightening, then added, "Kindness is never too late. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." As he stepped down from the podium, the crowd rose, a sea of uniforms and faces, saluting in silence. Walter straightened, his shoulders squared, and returned the gesture. His eyes, once downcast, now looked forward, clear and unwavering, toward a future he could finally claim. Justice, he knew, could be slow, a distant star in a night sky, but it was never absent. It arrived in the quiet moments, a child's essay, a friend's dinner table, a plaque on a courthouse wall. It arrived because people chose to remember, to act, to care. Walter's story was proof that even the forgotten could be found, that hope could endure if you held on long enough. In a quiet, unassuming town nestled in the heart of America, a young woman named Clara lived with a fire in her heart for justice. She was no stranger to the sting of unfairness, having grown up in a community where whispers of corruption often floated through the air like unwanted dust. Clara's days were spent working at a local diner, pouring coffee and serving plates of eggs to regulars who knew her by name. But beneath her warm smile and quick wit, she carried a heavy burden, a deep, unshakable belief that the world could be better, fairer, if only someone would stand up and fight for what was right. Her heart ached with the weight of this conviction, and every night, as she wiped down the diner's counters, she dreamed of a day when truth would rise above deceit. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves outside painted the streets in hues of amber and crimson, Clara overheard a conversation that set her soul ablaze. Two men, regulars at the diner, spoke in hushed tones about a local official who had been siphoning funds meant for the town's school system. Their voices dripped with resignation, as if this betrayal was just another fact of life, like the changing seasons. Clara's hands trembled as she refilled their coffee mugs, her mind racing with indignation. How could they sit there, accepting such a wrong as if it were inevitable? Her chest tightened with a mix of anger and determination, and in that moment, she knew she couldn't stay silent. The thought of children losing out on books, teachers, and opportunities because of one person's greed gnawed at her conscience, urging her to act. Clara's evenings were often spent scrolling through social media, where she stumbled upon a platform called Q Incredible Stories. It was a beacon of hope in her eyes, a digital haven where ordinary people shared tales of courage, where the powerless found a voice to challenge the mighty. Each story she read filled her with a renewed sense of purpose, as if the collective bravery of strangers was weaving a tapestry of change. Inspired, Clara decided to take her discovery about the corrupt official to this platform. Her heart pounded as she typed out her findings, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard as doubt crept in. What if no one believed her? What if she was dismissed as just another idealistic dreamer? But the image of those school children, robbed of their future, pushed her fears aside. She hit post, her breath catching as her words went out into the world. The response was slow at first, like the first drops of rain before a storm. A few likes, a couple of shares. But then, something miraculous happened. People began to rally around Clara's cause. Strangers from across the country, united by their own frustrations with injustice, began sharing her story. Comments flooded in, some from parents who feared for their children's education, others from workers who had seen similar wrongs in their own towns. Clara's heart swelled with a mix of pride and disbelief as she read their words. She hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to hope that her small act of defiance could ripple so far. Each notification felt like a spark, igniting her resolve to keep pushing forward. Among those who saw Clara's post was James, a retired journalist who had spent decades chasing truth in a world that often preferred lies. His hair was gray now, his hands weathered from years of gripping pens and pounding keyboards, but his spirit remained unyielding. Reading Clara's words, he felt a familiar stirring in his chest, a call to action he hadn't felt since his reporting days. James had seen too many stories buried, too many truths silenced by those in power. Clara's courage reminded him of his younger self, back when he believed one person's voice could make a difference. His throat tightened as he thought of his own daughter, now grown, who had once asked him why he fought so hard for stories that seemed to change nothing. This time, he vowed, would be different. James reached out to Clara, offering his expertise to dig deeper into the official's misdeeds. Together, they uncovered a trail of documents, bank statements, emails, and contracts that painted a damning picture of corruption. Each discovery felt like a small victory, but it also weighed heavily on them. Clara felt the pressure of being a beacon for others, her stomach twisting with the fear of letting them down. James, meanwhile, wrestled with memories of past battles lost, wondering if he still had the strength to see this through. Yet their shared determination bound them together, like soldiers in a quiet war against deceit. As their evidence grew, so did the movement. Incredible Stories became a rallying point, a digital town square where people shared their own experiences of injustice, each story adding fuel to the fire. Clara and James organized a town hall meeting, their nerves frayed, but their resolve unshaken. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and anger. Clara stood at the podium, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each word. She spoke of the children, the schools, the betrayal, and the power of standing together. James followed, his gravelly voice recounting the evidence with the precision of a seasoned storyteller. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a cathartic release of pent-up frustration. In the weeks that followed, the pressure mounted. The corrupt official, cornered by the mounting evidence and public outcry, resigned in disgrace. An investigation was launched, and funds were redirected back to the schools. Clara walked through the town square one evening, seeing children playing under the glow of streetlights, their laughter a reminder BMP of why she had fought. Her heart was full, but a quiet part of her wondered if this victory was just the beginning. James, too, felt a sense of peace, though he knew the world was far from perfect. He sat at his desk, drafting a new story for Incredible Stories, urging others to share their truths, to keep the flame of justice alive. Clara and James continued to inspire others, their story a testament to the power of doing what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. They encouraged everyone they met to share their own stories, to spread the message that truth and justice could prevail if people dared to stand up. Clara, wiping down the diner's counters late at night, felt a quiet pride in her heart. James, typing away in his small apartment, smiled at the thought of his daughter reading his latest piece. Together they had shown that one voice, amplified by many, could change the world. One story at a time.